Ethan had always known Max was a curious dog. He'd seen him chase after rustling leaves, sniff out hidden treats, and even dig up old bones from the garden. But this time, something was different. Max wouldn't stop digging. At first, Ethan found it amusing. A dog doing what dogs do, pawing at the dirt, tail wagging with excitement. But as the days went by, the hole in the backyard grew bigger. Max wasn't just digging for fun. He was searching for something, and he wouldn't let it go. Ethan tried everything to distract him. Treats, walks, even scolding him. But every time he looked away, Max was back at it, determined to uncover whatever lay beneath the earth. It wasn't just playful curiosity anymore. It was an obsession. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan stood by the back door, watching Max dig again. The dog's paws moved frantically, dirt flying in every direction. Then suddenly he stopped. A sharp whimper broke the silence, followed by an urgent bark. Something was there. Ethan's stomach tightened. He stepped forward, his heartbeat quickening. As he knelt beside Max, he noticed something peeking through the disturbed earth. A glimpse of fabric, old and tattered. With trembling hands, Ethan brushed away the dirt, and what he uncovered would change everything. He wasn't ready for this. No one could be. The air was still, thick with the scent of freshly turned earth. The once pristine backyard now bore the marks of restless digging. Clumps of dirt scattered, deep grooves etched into the ground where Max's paws had worked tirelessly. Ethan stood at the edge of the hole, gripping the railing of the porch, watching his dog with growing unease. There was something different about the way Max was digging. It wasn't the playful, mindless habit of a bored pet. This was something else, something urgent. His movements were sharp, purposeful. His tail, usually wagging with excitement, remained stiff, ears perked forward as if listening for something Ethan couldn't hear. A strange weight settled in Ethan's chest. He had spent years in this house, walked across this very yard countless times. Yet now, standing there in the dimming light, an odd sensation crept over him, like he was intruding, like he was standing on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Max let out a sudden bark, his claws scraping against something beneath the soil. Ethan's breath hitched. The sound was different. Not the dull thud of dirt, but something harder, something solid. A cold breeze swept through the yard, rustling the trees, making the night feel heavier. Ethan swallowed, stepping forward. He didn't know what Max had found, but for the first time in a long while, he felt afraid of his own backyard, and he had no idea why. Ethan had always considered himself a practical man. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, bad omens, or strange coincidences. Life was straightforward, things happened for a reason, and there was always a logical explanation. But as he stood in his backyard, watching his dog tear at the earth with a near-obsessive focus, he felt something he couldn't quite explain. Max had been Ethan's companion for years. Ever since he adopted him as a scrappy little pup from the shelter, they had been inseparable ever since. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family. Loyal to a fault, protective, and always sensing things before Ethan did. And right now, Max was sensing something buried beneath them. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, sighing. His life had been quiet lately, almost too quiet. After his father's passing, he had moved back into his childhood home, the house he had sworn he'd never return to. It was filled with too many memories, too many ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, but the kind that lingered in old furniture, in the cracks of the walls, in the silence of empty rooms. Still, he had managed. The house was his now, and he had made it his own, finding comfort in routine. Morning coffee on the back porch. Long walks with Max, weekend repairs to fix the wear and tear time had left behind. It was a simple life and he liked it that way. But tonight, as he watched Max dig deeper and deeper, Ethan felt that fragile sense of normalcy begin to crack. A memory surfaced. His father, standing in this very yard, staring at the ground with an expression Ethan couldn't quite place. He had been younger then, maybe 10 or 11, playing with Max's predecessor, an old golden retriever named Duke. He remembered asking his father what he was looking at. His father had simply shaken his head and muttered, Some things are better left buried. Ethan hadn't thought much of it then. But now, standing in the same spot years later, he couldn't shake the eerie weight of those words. Max let out another bark, his paws scraping frantically against something solid again. Ethan's stomach twisted. He didn't believe in bad omens. He had always told himself that. But for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Ethan stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as Max continued digging with relentless energy. The dog's usual excitement had transformed into something else. Something urgent. Dirt flew in all directions, and the hole deepened, revealing something just beneath the surface. "Max, stop," Ethan said, his voice firmer this time. But Max didn't listen. He let out a sharp bark and kept clawing at the earth, his body tense, his tail stiff. Ethan swallowed hard and crouched down, his hands hesitating over the loose soil. His mind wrestled between two thoughts. Part of him wanted to stop, to leave whatever was buried beneath untouched. But another part, the one that wouldn't let go of the eerie feeling creeping up his spine, needed to know. With a deep breath, he reached in and pulled at the dirt-covered fabric Max had exposed. It was old, tattered, and as he dusted off more, he saw a faded pattern. Something familiar but distant. The smell of damp soil mixed with something faintly metallic. His stomach twisted as his fingers brushed against something solid. Not just solid wood. His pulse pounded in his ears. He dug faster now, his hands working alongside Max's paws, until the outline of a small wooden box emerged from the ground. It was about the size of a shoebox, its edges worn and splintered. The lid, though partially buried, had been sealed shut by time and earth. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at it. His father's words echoed in his mind. Some things are better left buried. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the box, his fingers brushing over its rough surface. Was this what his father had been hiding? And if so, why? Max let out a low whimper, nudging Ethan's arm with his nose. The dog's eyes, usually full of warmth, seemed clouded with unease. Ethan exhaled sharply and gripped the box. With a hesitant tug, he pulled it free from the dirt. The weight of it surprised him. It wasn't just old wood and air. There was something inside. His heart pounded as he brushed off the last layer of soil and hesitantly pried open the lid. The rusty hinges creaked, resisting before finally giving way. Inside, nestled in old, discolored cloth, lay a stack of faded photographs. Beneath them, a bundle of letters, the edges crinkled and yellowed with age. And at the very bottom, something that made Ethan's breath hitch. A small, rusted locket. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his palm. The surface was scratched, the clasp nearly rusted shut. But when he pried it open, his stomach lurched. Inside was a photograph of a woman, one he had never seen before. And beneath the photo, carefully folded, was a brittle newspaper clipping. His eyes scanned the headline, and the blood drained from his face. Local woman vanishes without a trace. Authorities suspect foul play. Ethan's grip tightened on the locket as the pieces of an old, buried truth started falling into place. His father had always been a private man, guarded, quiet, and now Ethan was starting to understand why. Max let out a sharp bark, jolting Ethan back to the present. He looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet the backyard had become. The wind had died down, and the usual chirping of crickets had faded into an eerie silence. Ethan took a shaky breath and pulled the stack of letters from the box. The handwriting was neat, precise, but unfamiliar. He unfolded the first one, his fingers pressing against the faded ink. "If you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He had uncovered something he was never meant to find. And now there was no turning back. Ethan's fingers trembled as he clutched the letter. His eyes darted between the yellowed paper and the rusted locket resting in his palm. The words on the letter felt heavy, almost suffocating. "If you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light." Max let out a low growl, his ears perked up. The dog took a step back from the hole, his gaze fixed beyond the fence, as if sensing something Ethan couldn't see. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, making the old wooden fence creak. Ethan swallowed hard. He was being irrational. Just because he had dug up an old box didn't mean anything supernatural was at play. And yet, why did it feel like someone was watching? Ethan inhaled deeply and forced himself to focus. He unfolded the rest of the letter, scanning the words. The ink had smudged in places, but the message was clear. I never meant for it to happen this way, but secrets have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Just like the past. Just like her. Her? Ethan's pulse quickened. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of it all. He sifted through the other letters, but most were too faded to read. However, a few words stood out. Regret. Forgiveness. It was never supposed to happen. A sudden crack echoed through the yard. Ethan jumped, whipping around toward the house. The back porch light flickered just once before steadying again. His breath hitched in his throat. He turned back to the box, rummaging through its contents until his fingers brushed against the newspaper clipping once more. His eyes scanned the article, this time paying closer attention to the details. The missing woman, her name was Lillian Carter. She had disappeared nearly 30 years ago. No suspects, no body, no clues. Just gone. Ethan's heart pounded. Why would his father have this? Max let out another low growl. This time, his fur bristled, his tail stiff. He wasn't just reacting to the digging anymore. Something was wrong. Ethan hesitated, then stood up, scanning the yard. The trees cast long shadows across the ground, stretching unnaturally in the dim light. The fence stood as it always had, weathered but sturdy. Yet, the air felt different, thicker, heavier. The silence was unsettling. A creak. Ethan turned sharply toward the back porch. His breath caught in his throat. The screen door, it was open. It had been closed just minutes ago. His grip tightened around the locket. His mind scrambled for explanations, but none of them made sense. He had been alone in the yard. The door should not have moved. A sudden chill crawled up his spine. Something inside him whispered that this wasn't just about an old box. This was about something or someone who had never truly left. Max whined and took a cautious step closer to Ethan, pressing against his leg. The dog's usual confidence had wavered, and that scared Ethan more than anything. He needed answers, and something told him he wasn't going to like what he found next. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The screen door creaked slightly in the wind, swaying just enough to send a shiver down his spine. He swallowed hard, gripping the locket tighter in his palm. Max stood beside him, ears flat, muscles tensed. The dog had never been this frightened before. For a moment, Ethan debated running back inside, slamming the door, and pretending none of this had happened. But deep down, he knew this had been buried for a reason, and now that it had been uncovered, there was no going back. Taking a steadying breath, he knelt back down, hands trembling as he lifted the remaining contents of the box. Another faded piece of paper, an old photograph, and then, beneath the layers of decay, something cold and metallic. A small key. His stomach twisted. He had seen this kind of key before, on the old shed at the far end of the yard. The shed his father had always told him to stay away from. Ethan stood up, staring toward the darkened structure. It had been years since he even thought about it. Overgrown vines curled around its edges. The door warped from time and weather. His father had once called it storage, but Ethan had never seen him go in or out. Max let out a low whimper, glancing up at him as if to say, "Are we really doing this?" Ethan nodded to himself, then stepped forward. The walk to the shed felt longer than it should have. Each step made the air heavier, the silence thicker. The key felt ice-cold in his palm, and as he reached the rusted lock, a chill crawled down his spine. With one last glance at Max, he pushed the key into the lock and turned. Click. The door groaned as it swung open. At first, all he saw was dust, the dim light of his phone barely cutting through the darkness. Then a smell. It wasn't just dust and mildew. It was something older, something rotting. Ethan covered his nose and stepped inside, shining his phone's flashlight around the cramped space. The walls were lined with old furniture, forgotten tools, and boxes stacked haphazardly. But in the center of the room, a wooden chest. Not just any chest, the same one from the old photograph. His breath hitched. His fingers felt numb as he stepped closer, brushing off decades of dust. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he gripped the rusted latch and forced it open. Inside, a bundle of cloth. Shaking, Ethan pulled at the fabric, and beneath it, something horrifying was revealed. Bones. A human skeleton, small, fragile, tucked away like a secret never meant to be found. Max let out a sharp bark, stepping back. Ethan felt his entire body go cold. His knees nearly buckled. He tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, suffocating. And then he saw it, the necklace. A delicate silver chain still clung to the brittle bones, barely visible beneath the dust. His trembling hands reached for the locket he had found earlier, flipping it open. Inside there was a name, Lillian Carter, the missing woman. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His father, his own father, had something to do with this. A sharp gust of wind slammed the shed door shut, making him jump. The shadows seemed to press in around him, suffocating, heavy with the weight of the truth. Then a voice, soft, broken, a whisper that sent ice through his veins. "Thank you." Ethan spun around, his phone shaking in his grip, but the shed was empty. Only dust and silence remained. But something had changed. The air felt lighter. The overwhelming heaviness that had gripped the yard for years. It was gone. Max let out a small, relieved huff, wagging his tail just once. Ethan swallowed hard, looking down at the remains one last time. He knew what he had to do. That night, he called the police. It didn't take long for them to confirm what he already knew. The bones belonged to Lillian Carter, a woman who had vanished decades ago, whose story had been buried beneath lies and dirt. His father never spoke about it again. Ethan didn't ask, but the weight of the truth was something he carried forever. And Max never dug in the backyard again. Ethan stood at the edge of the backyard, staring at the patch of dirt where it all began. The grass had been replanted, the soil no longer disturbed, but the memories remained. Max sat beside him, his tail flicking lazily. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't anxious or restless. Whatever had driven him to dig, whatever force had been pulling him toward the truth, was at peace now. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind heavy with everything he had learned. The police told him Lillian Carter had gone missing 50 years ago. The case had long gone cold, her family left without answers. But now, at last, she had been found. He had spent nights replaying the events in his head, wondering what his father knew, or didn't want to admit. There were questions Ethan would never get answers to, ghosts of the past that would always linger in the corners of his mind. But one thing was clear: some secrets refuse to stay buried. And sometimes, the dead don't rest until the truth is uncovered. Ethan looked down at Max and scratched behind his ears. "You knew, didn't you?" Max let out a soft huff, tilting his head toward Ethan. Maybe animals sense things humans can't. Maybe Max had been trying to tell him all along. Or maybe, just maybe, Lillian's spirit had been reaching out in the only way she could. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts before. Now he wasn't so sure. As he walked back inside, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The wind rustled the trees, the house groaned in the distance, and for the first time in years, the backyard was silent. But Ethan knew, somewhere out there, Lillian Carter was finally at peace. And maybe, just maybe, she was watching. The end. What did you think of today's unexpected twist? Would you have reacted the same way if you discovered something like that in your own backyard? Let us know your thoughts or predictions in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think happened after this shocking discovery. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story made an impact on you. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss any of our emotional, spine-chilling tales. Share this story with your friends and family. Let's see if they can guess what's coming next. Stay tuned for more heart-wrenching stories that will leave you at the edge of your seat. Join our community for even more unforgettable moments.